Most people know, in a vague and general sense, that sex tends to make them feel better. The tension that had been building through a difficult week seems to dissolve. Sleep comes more easily afterward. The problem that felt enormous an hour ago somehow feels more manageable. Most people chalk this up to simple pleasure, to the fact that enjoyable things tend to improve your mood, temporarily, the way a good meal or a hot shower does. But that explanation undersells what is actually happening by a significant margin. What occurs in the body during and after sex is not a mild mood lift. It is a coordinated, multi-system biological response that directly counteracts the physiological effects of stress at almost every level: hormonal, neurological, cardiovascular, and immunological. And when you look at the research in detail, it becomes clear that the relationship between sex and stress relief is not incidental. It is, in important ways, structural. The two systems are wired to interact. To understand why, you have to start with what stress actually does to the body. Because stress is not simply a feeling, it is a physical state. When your brain perceives a threat, whether that threat is a predator, a looming deadline, a difficult conversation, or a piece of bad news, it activates a response system called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. This system triggers the release of two primary stress hormones: adrenaline, which produces the immediate fight-or-flight response, and cortisol, which sustains that heightened state over a longer period. Heart rate increases. Blood pressure rises. Muscles tense. Digestion slows. The immune system shifts into a specific defensive configuration. The body is preparing, at a biological level, to deal with a threat. This system is extraordinarily effective at what it was designed for: short-term survival in physically dangerous situations. The problem is that modern stressors are almost never short-term or physically dangerous. A difficult boss, financial anxiety, relationship tension, a relentless workload — these are chronic, ongoing, and cannot be resolved by running or fighting. So the HPA axis stays activated, cortisol stays elevated, and a body running in sustained stress mode begins to accumulate damage: disrupted sleep, suppressed immune function, increased inflammation, elevated cardiovascular risk, impaired memory and cognitive function. Chronic stress is not a mood problem, it is a medical one. Sex intervenes in this system at multiple points simultaneously. And that is what makes it categorically different from most other forms of stress relief. The first and most direct intervention is hormonal. Research consistently shows that sexual activity, and in particular orgasm, produces a significant spike in oxytocin, a neuropeptide released primarily from the hypothalamus. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone, but that label understates its physiological role. One of oxytocin's primary functions is to directly suppress cortisol production. The two hormones operate in something close to opposition. When oxytocin rises, cortisol tends to fall. A study published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology found that participants who had engaged in sexual intercourse showed significantly lower cortisol reactivity when subsequently exposed to stressful situations, compared to participants who had engaged in no sexual activity or non-penetrative sexual contact. The cortisol-suppressing effect of oxytocin wasn't just measurable in the moment, it carried forward, providing a measurable buffer against stress reactivity for a period afterward. Simultaneously, sex triggers the release of endorphins, the same class of neuropeptides released during intense exercise, along with dopamine and serotonin. Endorphins bind to opioid receptors in the brain, producing analgesia and a generalized sense of well-being. Dopamine activates the brain's reward circuitry. Serotonin stabilizes mood and promotes the feeling of calm that follows. This neurochemical combination, oxytocin suppressing cortisol, endorphins reducing pain and tension, dopamine activating reward, serotonin stabilizing mood, does not happen together in response to most other activities. It is a relatively unique neurochemical event. The second point of intervention is cardiovascular. Chronic stress keeps heart rate and blood pressure persistently elevated, both of which over time contribute to cardiovascular damage. Sexual activity initially raises both, then produces a significant and sustained drop below baseline during the resolution phase that follows. Research by psychologist Stuart Brodie at the University of the West of Scotland tracked blood pressure responses to various stressors and found that individuals who had engaged in penetrative sex in the days prior showed lower blood pressure responses to stress than those who had engaged in other sexual activities or no sexual activity at all. The cardiovascular recovery effect was specific and measurable, not simply a result of physical exertion, but of the full physiological cycle of arousal and resolution. The third intervention is in the nervous system itself. The human nervous system has two primary operating modes: the sympathetic mode, which governs fight or flight and is dominant under stress, and the parasympathetic mode, sometimes called rest and digest, which governs recovery, repair, and calm. These two systems cannot be fully active at the same time. Chronic stress keeps the sympathetic system dominant, suppressing the parasympathetic and preventing the body from entering the recovery states it needs to function properly. Sex, particularly in its resolution phase, is one of the more reliable activators of the parasympathetic nervous system available to most people. The drop in heart rate, the muscle relaxation, the tendency towards sleep, the reduction in vigilance, these are all parasympathetic responses. The body is not simply feeling better in a vague sense. It is physically shifting its operating mode, from activation to recovery, from threat response to repair. This is why sleep after sex tends to come more easily. The nervous system has been guided, through a specific physiological process, back toward the state in which sleep is possible. There is also an immunological dimension that is less commonly discussed. Prolonged cortisol elevation suppresses immune function in specific and measurable ways, reducing the activity of natural killer cells, impairing antibody production, and increasing susceptibility to infection. Research by psychologist Karl Charnetsky at Wilkes University found that individuals who engaged in sexual activity once or twice a week showed significantly higher levels of immunoglobulin a key antibody that forms the first line of immune defense, compared to those who were sexually abstinent or who had sex very infrequently. The immune effect appeared to be tied specifically to moderate, regular sexual activity, not to frequency alone. Very high frequency showed diminishing returns, suggesting that the mechanism is tied more to the hormonal and autonomic effects than to simple physical stimulation. It is worth being precise about what this evidence does and does not say. It does not say that sex is the only effective stress response, or that it is accessible or appropriate in all circumstances, or that it resolves the underlying sources of chronic stress in any person's life. What it says is that the body has a specific, multi-system physiological response to sexual activity: hormonal, neurological, cardiovascular, autonomic, and immunological, that directly counteracts the specific, multi-system physiological damage that chronic stress produces. The match is not coincidental. It reflects the fact that both systems, stress response and sexual response, are deeply embedded in the same underlying biology, governed by overlapping hormones and the same autonomic nervous system, and that the activation of one has measurable effects on the state of the other. There is one more dimension worth naming, and it is perhaps the least reducible to chemistry: the role of genuine connection. Research on the stress-relieving effects of sex consistently finds that the effects are stronger when the experience involves emotional intimacy. When oxytocin is released, not just in response to physical stimulation, but in the context of felt safety and closeness with another person. The neuroscience here is consistent with a broader body of research on social connection and health. Human beings are a deeply social species whose nervous systems are calibrated to respond to the presence of a trusted other as a safety signal. When that signal is present, the HPA axis quiets. Cortisol falls. The parasympathetic system becomes easier to access. The stress response, designed for isolation and threat, becomes less necessary when the body registers that it is not alone. This is why the research on loneliness and health outcomes is as striking as it is. Social isolation produces cortisol profiles similar to those seen in chronic stress, because, for a species wired for connection, isolation is a form of threat. And it helps explain why the stress-relieving effects of sex are not purely mechanical, not simply a matter of hormones and nerve endings. They are also, in part, the physiological effect of closeness itself, of the body registering, in a language older than words, that it is safe. So when sex makes you feel better, less tense, more capable of sleep, more able to face the week ahead. That is not a vague mood effect. That is cortisol dropping, oxytocin rising, the parasympathetic nervous system reclaiming ground from the sympathetic, the immune system shifting back toward normal function, and the deepest regulatory systems in your body responding to an experience of safety and connection. The stress was always physical. It turns out the relief is too.